The desert has a way of swallowing people whole, not with teeth, but with silence. Before the story begins, take 1 second, hit subscribe, share this story with your friends, and ride with us into a world where Sudba, fate, never asks permission. The cowboy found her at dawn when the sky was still bruised purple and the coyotes were arguing with the wind. She stood alone near a dry wash barefoot, her dress torn and stained with dust and old blood that wasn't hers. She didn't cry. That was the first thing that unsettled him. A child, no more than 10 winters by his reckoning, should have been sobbing, screaming, begging the sky for mercy. Instead, the Apache girl stared back at him with eyes too old for her face. His name was Thomas Cole, a widowed rancher who had buried his wife and unborn son 2 years earlier under a cottonwood tree. He had ridden out that morning looking for a lost calf. What he found instead was a life balanced on the edge of disappearance. He dismounted slowly, hands open, voice low. He spoke as if the land itself might shatter if he raised his tone. "You're safe," he said, though he had no proof of that. The girl didn't answer. She held a small medicine pouch to her chest like it was the last piece of the world she trusted. Thomas noticed the signs then. The burned circle where a camp had been, the broken arrows, the trampled mesquite. Raiders had passed through, or soldiers. Either way, whoever she belonged to was gone. When he offered her water, she drank carefully, watching his eyes, measuring his soul. When he offered his horse, she shook her head once, fiercely, so he walked. By the time the sun climbed high, she followed. He never asked her name. In Apache belief, names carried power. He let her choose when to speak. When they reached his ranch by nightfall, she finally whispered one word, Aita, firefly. He took her in without ceremony, fed her, clothed her, gave her the small room that had once been meant for a child who never lived. He didn't try to replace her people or erase her ways. He let her face the east in the morning. He let her keep her pouch. He let her grieve in silence. Years passed like wind through tall grass. Aida grew strong, quiet, sharp-eyed. She learned English but thought in Apache. She rode like she was born in the saddle. She never forgot who she was or who she had lost. Thomas never called himself her father. But he stayed. When sickness came, he sat through the nights. When nightmares woke her screaming in Apache, he waited until the shaking passed. When the world treated her like something to be feared or owned, he stood between her and the cruelty of men. The town whispered, why would a white rancher raise an Apache girl? What was he hiding? What was she? The answer came on a day soaked in blood and revelation. A band of Apache rode in under a white cloth. At their head was a woman wrapped in black buckskin, her hair streaked with silver, her face carved by grief and command. She looked at Aida and fell to her knees. "My daughter," she said, the truth spilled like thunder. Aida was not orphaned by chance. She was the daughter of Nayland, a widowed Apache leader whose husband had been murdered under false truce. Raiders had scattered her people. Aida had been hidden, sent away to survive, and she had... Nayland rose and faced Thomas Cole. "You did not steal her," she said. "You guarded her." That night, fires burned across the land. Songs were sung for the lost and the found. Thomas understood then. He had not adopted a child. He had been entrusted with a legacy. Time did not stand still after that night. It sharpened. Aida grew into womanhood with a grace that carried both steel and mercy. She was no longer a child, and the world no longer pretended she was invisible. Men noticed her, some with respect, others with hunger. Thomas noticed something else, how she carried herself like someone who knew where she came from and where she was going. Nayland returned often. Stories were shared, traditions woven back together. Aida walked between worlds now, fluent in both, owned by neither. Trouble followed. A railroad syndicate set its eyes on the land, Apache and ranch alike. They brought papers, guns, and men who believed destiny could be signed away with ink and bullets. Thomas refused to sell. So did Nalin. The threat turned violent. One night, Thomas was ambushed riding home, shot, left bleeding beneath a moon that did not care. Aita found him by tracking the blood through the dust. She did not scream, she did not panic. She fought. She rode through gunfire, dragged him to safety, and stood guard until dawn with a rifle in her hands and death in her eyes. When Thomas woke, he understood something profound. The child he had saved had become the woman who saved him. The final battle came at the canyon pass. Ranchers and Apache stood together. Old enemies became allies. The land remembered who truly belonged. When the smoke cleared, the syndicate was gone. The dead were mourned. The living remained. Nalin prepared to leave, her people moving north. She took Thomas's hands. "You gave her roots," she said, "not chains." Aita stood between them, no longer lost, no longer borrowed. "I walk my own path now," she said. Thomas nodded, pride and ache tangled in his chest. She rode away at dawn, but not into disappearance. She rode into becoming. And the cowboy watched the horizon, knowing that some acts of love do not claim, do not possess, and do not demand repayment. They simply change the world. The night Thomas Cole was left bleeding under the moon, the land held its breath. Aita knelt beside him, pressing her hands against the wound, her mind already far ahead of the fear. She tore cloth from her sleeve, packed the hole with clean dirt the way her mother had taught her, and whispered a prayer not meant for white men or Apache alone, but for whatever watched over those who refused to quit. Coyotes watched from the ridges. Stars burned cold and sharp. When she lifted him onto the horse, she felt the weight of years settle into her bones. Years she hadn't lived yet, years that had lived through her. She rode through the night without rest, choosing gullies and shadowed draws, moving like smoke. At dawn she reached the ranch. The foreman stared, stunned, as Aita slid from the saddle, her dress stiff with blood, her eyes calm and commanding. She gave orders without raising her voice. "Boil water. Send for Nalin. Lock the gates." No one argued. Something in her tone carried finality. Thomas hovered between worlds for days. Fever took him. Memory came in pieces, the scent of sage, the sound of a child laughing years ago, the pressure of a small hand gripping his. When he woke for good, the room was quiet, and Aita sat by the window sharpening a blade, her reflection split by the glass. "You stayed," he rasped. She didn't look up. "You did." News traveled fast on the frontier. Too fast. The railroad syndicate, men in pressed coats with hired guns and a lawyer's smile, heard that their warning had failed. They heard that an Apache woman and a white rancher had bled together and lived. They heard the land itself had refused to bend. They came with papers first, then threats, then fire. A barn burned one night, the flames licking the sky like a signal. No cattle were lost, but the message was clear. Thomas gathered the ranchers at dawn. He spoke plain and slow. "Sell and be spared, or stand and be crushed." Faces hardened, spines straightened. They had all buried someone. They had all learned that mercy rarely came from men who carried ledgers and guns. Nalin arrived at sunset with riders, women and men alike, faces painted not for war, but for resolve. She embraced Aita, then studied Thomas with eyes that saw beyond flesh. "You taught her how to stay," Nalin said. "Now she will choose when to go." Aita listened to both worlds argue strategy around a fire that night, roots, numbers, terrain. She said nothing until the plans circled back on themselves, tangled in pride. Then she stood. "They will come through the canyon pass," she said. "They believe we fear it. They believe we will scatter." She drew lines in the dirt with a stick, marking shadows, rockfalls, wind patterns. She spoke of echoes and dust, and how sound lied in narrow places. When she finished, the fire popped, and silence followed. Nalin smiled. Thomas nodded once. The plan became hers. The morning of the fight dawned brittle and bright. The canyon swallowed the syndicate's men like a mouth closing. Rifles cracked. Horses screamed. Smoke turned the air into a living thing. Aita moved with terrifying clarity. Signal here, pull back there, strike and vanish. She was nowhere and everywhere. When a gunman cornered her behind a boulder, she disarmed him with the butt of her rifle and left him alive, shaking. Mercy was a choice, not a weakness. Thomas held the left flank with ranchers who had never fought beside Apache before. They learned quickly. Cover your partner. Trust the signal. Don't chase the kill. When the syndicate's hired captain tried to rally his men, Naylin rode straight through the center, her voice cutting the chaos like a blade. The line broke. By noon it was done. The dead were gathered and honored. The living bound wounds and counted breaths. The canyon released its grip. Wind carried the smoke away. The lawyer fled before sundown. That night, under a sky scrubbed clean by victory and grief, Naylin prepared to lead her people north. The land here would remember them. But survival demanded movement. She called Aita to her side. You can come, Naylin said, or you can stay. Neither path erases the other. Aita looked at Thomas, older, thinner, alive, because she had chosen him the way he had once chosen her. She looked at the ranch, the cottonwood, the that had held her nightmares and her growth. She felt the pull of the road and the anchor of the soil. I will walk between, she said. I will return. I will ride out. I will not disappear. Naylin touched her forehead. Pride shone there, fierce and gentle. At dawn, the riders left. Dust rose and settled. Thomas stood at the fence as Aita saddled her horse, not to leave forever but to begin. She turned once. You gave me a home, she said. I give myself a future. He tipped his hat. Words failed him. They were not needed. Aita rode toward the horizon, not as a lost child, not as a borrowed daughter, but as a woman who had learned that family can be chosen, that blood can be honored without chains, and that love, real love, does not cage the wild. The land exhaled, and the story, carried by hoofbeats and memory, rode on.